How close have you ever been to a real danger that looks like ordinary life? What if the thing that made your house feel wrong wasn't a creak in the floor or an old pipe? What if it was a person, quietly living inside the structure of your home, listening to your family breathe? The chilling secrets of Ethan trapped in the walls revealed. Viewer discretion is advised. This account describes stalking, home invasion, and homicide. Names of victims and survivors are treated with respect. The name Ethan is used in this narrative to represent the person involved in the real case of Danny LaPlante. All dates, legal outcomes, and verified facts follow the historical record. If you follow stories about crime and investigation, subscribe and drop a case suggestion in the form linked below. But first, stay with me through this one. It is a story about a slow escalation, missed signals, and a violation of the most private place anyone can have: a home. Ethan grew up with gaps that would follow him his whole life, gaps in the way he learned, felt, and connected. Teachers called his handwriting messy and his reading slow. The problems were labeled dyslexia and ADHD. At home, there was no patient tutor or steady hand to guide him. What little structure he might have found in school dissolved into afternoons full of small thefts, petty vandalism, and mischief that never seemed to stick to him long enough to change course. The pattern, to those who later pieced the case together, was familiar. Early offenses that seemed trivial at the time, each one feeding a feeling of control. Neighbors remembered a quiet boy who drifted at the edges of groups, the kind who watched more than he spoke. Those who tried to reach him described brusque behavior, a defensiveness that slid into anger when confronted. In the private spaces of his life, where attention was scarce and frustration was constant, control hardened into an obsession. For Ethan, the thefts became less about items and more about power, about making strangers feel unsettled in their own rooms. That power took a new form. It wasn't enough to take things. He began to rearrange evidence of his presence. Clothes moved from one closet to another, a cherished photograph found inexplicably on the kitchen table when the family swore it had been on the mantel, little notes left in places that made sense only if someone had been watching. The aim was not theft in a traditional sense, but manipulation. To make people doubt themselves, to be watched without knowing by someone who could vanish as easily as a shadow. Those who experience this kind of stalking often describe it as a campaign rather than a single crime, a slow erosion of the feeling of safety. By the mid-1980s, these incidents were no longer isolated. Local police had a growing paper trail of breaking and entering reports in the neighborhood. Still, the community carried on. Homes were places to sleep, to raise children, to make quiet plans. Then the events that would make the neighborhood's private anxieties public began to mount. Tina and Karen Bowen were sisters living with their father, Frank, in a modest home that sat like so many others on a tree-lined street. They were ordinary people with ordinary worries, until a pattern of small disturbances escalated into something profoundly invasive. At first it was the knocking, a series of subtle taps in the walls that would begin in the dead of night. Knock, 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 a sound that threaded through the family's sleep and into their waking mind. It was small enough to be dismissed as the house settling, but persistent enough that they could no longer ignore it. Night after night, the tapping migrated through the house, under the bedroom floor, behind a kitchen cabinet, along the basement foundation. In a home where sounds are often ignored, a pipe's groan, a furnace's cough, this rhythm took on agency. It felt deliberate, as if someone were communicating through the very bones of the house. The sisters tried different responses. They spoke about it at work. They joked about a ghost. They even staged a séance one evening, a desperate attempt to call whatever it was into the open. During those sessions, they reported extra knocks, messages left in places where no one had been, and small items rearranged in ways that could not be explained. On a basement wall, words appeared scrawled in red, not explicit but intentional, a mark that there had been another presence behind the drywall. Neighbors grew anxious. Frank Bowen, the girl's father, tightened locks and installed makeshift alarms. He called the police multiple times. Officers came, made notes, and left. The marks and manipulations continued, increasing the family's sense that someone was inside their lives in a way that could not be controlled. One night the situation crossed the boundary from terrifying suspicion to undeniable evidence. A police search after a specific tip and increasing reports found a narrow crawl space behind a closet, a cramped, dust-filled cavity that ran along the inner wall. Inside, curled up and breathing faintly, was a young man. He was in a place designed for insulation and wiring, the kind of void behind a cupboard where you might stow holiday decorations, except this space had been altered. Small holes had been cut into the facing so that someone inside could peer into a bedroom and watch the family sleep. The hiding space included crude ventilation and an arrangement of cloth that suggested the intent to remain undetected for long stretches of time. The discovery was freighted with the kind of intimacy that makes you rethink what safety means. A stranger had transformed the architecture of a home into a surveillance device. The notion of walls as shields had been inverted. They had become a hiding place, a point of observation. The evidence forced the concept into daylight. It wasn't an invisible ghost tapping at the night. It was a person with methods, with purpose. Police arrested the man found in that crawl space. For the family, the arrest confirmed a private horror. The person they had felt but not seen was real, flesh and intent. Neighbors who had complained about items moved, and small vandalism swore their earlier report suddenly made sense. For investigators, the case became an example of a stalker expanding from psychological terror to physical intrusion. He was held on charges related to breaking and entering and stalking, but the legal process moved in its own rhythm. Bail was set. The community watched, uneasy, as someone accused of living in the walls walked out the front door. Even after the discovery, after the holes, after the late-night tapping and the red marks on basement walls, the criminal justice reality allowed for release under conditions that would prove tragically insufficient. Upon release, Ethan did not fall silent. He returned to a pattern of escalation. The records show resumed burglaries, thefts that hinted at furiously focused preparation more than casual crime. He took more risks and grew more daring. Among the items linked to him were firearms, weapons that, in the hands of someone already showing a penchant for domination and voyeurism, multiplied the danger. Neighbors later described seeing him at odd hours, sometimes carrying a bag or acting as if he was rehearsing moves no one should have to imagine. Investigators pieced together a trail. In late 1987, Ethan reportedly visited a house multiple times, not just to steal but to study. He left and returned, a behavior that shifts an offender from opportunistic criminality into ominous predation. To psychologists familiar with escalation, this pattern often means one thing: the offender is reducing uncertainty. Each return visit gives them more data, more control, and less fear of being discovered. On December 1, 1987, the line between observation and violence broke. That morning, Andrew Gustafson walked into his home and encountered a scene that would shatter a family. The house had been entered. The immediate discovery was of a nature that made clear there had been a struggle and fatal injuries. In this account there are no grisly descriptions. The focus is on facts and the human cost, not on spectacle. 3 members of the Gustafson family, Priscilla and 2 young children, Abigail and William, did not survive the attack. Andrew, who found the scene, was left to contend with the loss, the medical aftermath, and the long road of trying to rebuild a life that had been violently altered. The investigation that followed relied on both old-fashioned police work and forensic science available at the time. Patrol officers and detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Witness statements put a man seen in the area shortly before the crime. The scent-tracking dogs, trained to follow human odor, were brought in and traced a path from the Gustafson property outward. That trail led investigators to dumpsters, alleys, and eventually to the suspect's movements, a sequence that culminated with authorities spotting a figure trying to hide in a trash receptacle. Ethan was found hiding in a dumpster, an ignoble end to a multi-day search. At the time of his arrest, officers recovered clothing that would become central to the case: garments stained in a manner consistent with involvement at the scene, gloves and other items that tied him to the events. Hair fibers collected from key places were later compared to hair found on the suspect. Those comparisons, combined with the scent dog trails and the circumstantial history of prior break-ins, created a chain of evidence strong enough to take the case forward. The trial in 1988 would focus on that chain. Prosecutors presented the physical evidence, the pattern of behavior, and the Bowen discovery as context for motive and method. Defense attorneys argued alternate scenarios and questioned the conclusiveness of each piece of forensic interpretation. The jury, weighing testimony and material proof, convicted Ethan in 1988. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences, an outcome that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the perceived risk this individual posed to the public. Those sentences were not light. They were meant to ensure, in legal terms, that he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. In the years that followed, the community that had once been simply a collection of houses and routines became a place of memory, grief, and anxious vigilance. The lives lost were not statistics, but people remembered in portrait and testimony. A mother, 2 children, and a spouse who carried the physical and emotional scars forward. Andrew Gustafson endured beyond the day of the murders. He rebuilt what he could of his life, remarried, and attempted to move forward while recognizing that some things do not heal. He spoke at times in public and in court about the enduring impact, about nights that returned him to the moment of discovery, and about the small, sharp reminders that can reawaken trauma. Victim impact statements in court painted a picture of long-term suffering, insomnia, fear of the ordinary, the collapse of perceived safety in domestic spaces. Community members who had once assumed evil was a distant thing now regarded neighbors and houses with different eyes. The Bowen family, whose early reports had been dismissed as trivial before the crawlspace discovery, continued to live with the knowledge that their precedents might have offered a warning had others acted sooner. In 2017, decades into his imprisonment, Ethan applied for parole. The request triggered psychiatric evaluations and reviews of his case history. The parole board examined his behavior in custody, the original evidence, and the statements from victims' families. The board denied parole, a decision that reflected the seriousness of the offenses and the danger the board assessed continued to exist. Court records indicate that his next formal parole eligibility is scheduled for 2067, a date set under the weight of the consecutive life terms and the legal structures intended to protect the public from reoffense. Throughout the legal process, certain forensic elements remained central. The physical items linking the suspect to the Gustafson scene, scent dog trails that placed him in the area following the crime, and fibers and hairs that, in the context of the case, added material support to the prosecutorial narrative. Those technical elements were not final proof on their own. They gained force when combined with the history of intrusion and the discovery at the Bowens' home. When investigators stitch evidence together, behavioral, testimonial, and physical, a clearer picture can emerge, even in the absence of eyewitness on the day of a crime. But this story is also a caution about how communities and systems respond to early warning signs. Small criminal acts, when treated as isolated errors, can serve as training grounds for escalation. The Bowen case illustrates a dynamic where psychological harassment precedes violent escalation. The pattern matters. Manipulation of the home environment, observation from hidden places, and repeated violations are signals that must be taken seriously by law enforcement, neighbors, and the justice system. Psychologists who study predatory behavior emphasize intent and habituation. Someone who tests boundaries repeatedly, stepping over social lines without immediate consequence, may interpret leniency as permission. Control becomes a learned expectation. That doesn't excuse actions, but it does highlight a preventable chain. Intervention at earlier stages could disrupt escalation. What form should that intervention take? It must be a coordinated one. Clear reporting protocols, careful follow-up by police when domestic stalking is asserted, community awareness without hysteria, and support services for families who are being observed and harassed. There is another layer to consider: the way ordinary people normalize threats until they are undeniable. The Bowen family's experience began with a knocking sound easily attributable to an old house. Many of us learn to rationalize odd occurrences rather than confront them. We tell ourselves it's nothing, that something will take care of itself. Those rationalizations explain part of the tragedy. A slow accumulation of anomalies that, taken alone, seem trivial. A missing photograph here, a rearranged shirt there, can add up into a pattern that, if noticed as pattern early enough, can be interrupted. Our legal institutions are another variable. Bail and pretrial release are designed to balance personal liberty with public safety. But when charges involve intrusions into domestic spaces and the clear intention to observe or control others, bail decisions require a nuanced risk assessment. The decision to release someone accused of living inside a family's walls ultimately contributed to this case's grim outcome. It's a reminder that criminal justice policy impacts real lives, and that the seemingly technical decisions made in courtrooms reverberate through neighborhoods. After conviction, the narrative shifts toward punishment, deterrence, and, for survivors, the paradox of justice, relief that a dangerous person is incarcerated, and frustration that sentences cannot restore what was lost. The Gustafson home could not be made whole again. Birthdays were missed. Vacations were never taken. Grief is a life that expands to fill a new shape. Public memorials cannot fill every private void. But justice, through conviction, at least marks social condemnation and seeks to prevent recurrence. The shadow left by an offender who hides in walls is different from other crimes because it invades the spatial metaphors of home. Walls are supposed to keep strangers out. For the victims, the notion that someone could be living in their structural void introduced a new vocabulary for fear. It wasn't only about the loss inflicted in a moment. It was about the knowledge that the privacy of a bedroom or the safety of a child's nursery could be compromised in ways most of us do not plan for. What can communities learn? First, the importance of listening without diminishing. When people report repeated break-ins, unexplained household changes, or a sense of being watched, those statements are not mere eccentricities. They are data that, if taken seriously, can prompt preventive actions. Targeted patrols, forensic sweeps of crawl spaces, community alerts that help neighbors recognize similar patterns, and protective measures for families at risk. Second, we need better channels for survivors to be heard and protected. Victim advocacy groups play a role in helping families navigate the legal system, secure restraining orders, and obtain counseling. Their work matters in the months and years when criminal cases fade from the news, but the human fallout endures. Third, professionals in law enforcement and mental health should continue to refine how they assess the risk of repeat and escalating behavior. Behavioral patterns like stalking, voyeurism, and targeted home intrusion are not random. They sit on a spectrum that too often tragically ends in violence. Early identification, interagency communication, and public education are practical ways to reduce the likelihood that patterns continue unchecked. There are moral questions in every stage of this story. How do we balance civil liberties with community safety? When is an act a youthful transgression, and when is it a sign of a predator forming? How do friends and family intervene when someone they care for begins to show increasingly concerning behaviors? None of these questions are simple, and none have tidy answers, but they are necessary ones. The Gustafson murders and the Bowen stalking are not isolated anomalies. They are case studies in a set of dynamics that can and should inform policy and personal action. For the victims and survivors, the aftermath is both legal and psychological. Years after the conviction, Andrew Gustafson spoke about rebuilding and about what recovery looks like when a family has lost its center. He acknowledged the struggle that many survivors face, the persistence of startling memories, and the need for ongoing mental health support. Communities must not only secure convictions, but also maintain resources to help families survive the long tail of trauma. The legal closure achieved in 1988, 3 consecutive life sentences, marked the end of one chapter. But it did not erase the fact that a person who had been discovered living in a crawl space could later commit more severe crimes. The chronology from 1985 through 1988 demonstrates the danger inherent in underestimating escalation. The parole review in 2017 and the continued incarceration make clear how the system at some points can act to limit future danger, even as it struggles with past decisions. There is one final uncomfortable truth. These cases also ask us to examine our own complacency. The habit of dismissing small wrongs allows danger to mature. It's easier to convince ourselves that a creak is a pipe than to imagine a stranger within our walls. But the people who live with chronic suspicion, the victims of stalking and intrusion, know that the price of being right is very high. Their courage in speaking out, in testifying, in living in the aftermath, is the real counterforce to the isolation predators seek to impose. If you are someone listening because you recognize patterns, a neighbor who sees a friend changing, a parent who notices a child withdrawing, do not wait for an obvious, unmistakable crime to act. Document incidents. Report them. Support families who come forward. Demand careful assessment from law enforcement. If you are a policymaker or advocate, push for training in stalking cases and for the cross-sharing of information across jurisdictions so patterns do not slip between agency cracks. The image of a person curled behind a closet, peering through a small cutout in a wall, remains one of the most haunting parts of this account. It is an image not because of violence alone, but because it forces us to confront a vulnerability most of us assume doesn't exist, that someone could make their way into the intimate geometry of our lives and become a quiet instrument of terror. In the years since, families marked anniversaries with both memory and a pledge to keep stories alive, not out of morbid curiosity, but to honor those who were taken and to warn those who can still act. The Gustafson names are not a statistic, they are a warning and an entreaty. The Bowens discovery is not just an early act of this narrative, it is proof that domestic vigilance matters. How close have you been to a psychopath? Maybe closer than you think. Maybe the warning signs were there all along, repeated small intrusions, rearranged belongings, furtive visits, odd sounds that were dismissed. The line between curiosity and danger is often thin, but the consequences of misreading it are not. If this story moved you, subscribe and consider supporting organizations that help victims of stalking, domestic intrusion, and violent crime. Links are in the description. Take these lessons home. Listen to the small disturbances. Be a neighbor who notices. Be a family who believes its members. The architecture of safety depends on vigilance, community, and a justice system that recognizes the gravity of escalating patterns before they end in irreparable loss. Remember the victims. Honor the survivors who carry the memory forward, and let the unnerving knowledge that someone once lived in the walls of a home remind us that safety must be actively protected, not assumed.